It's very rare that Eminence in Shadow make as big of a change as they did with the Gettan fight. It was definitely still satisfying to see him get his face punched in, but when compared to the intense action we were supposed to get, I can't help but wish that we got a little bit of that instead. I mean, not only did Sid fight with his wires, thus staying true to his whole John Smith persona, but there was also this entire second phase of the boss fight leading into the climactic beatdown. So, if you're curious as to Sid's true power while donning the identity of John Smith, this fight with Gettan is probably the closest we'll ever get to seeing it. Trust me when I say you're gonna want to see more than just the one-sided beatdown we got in the anime. Let's get started. Episode 27, Something Precious, covering only the epilogue from Volume 3 of the light novel. Starting things off in Shadow Garden, it turns out that the Seven Shadows decided to keep John Smith's identity to themselves. Had they gone and told the rest of the numbers, then the strike to their morale likely would have been unrecoverable. It was a burden Gamma and Alpha felt that they needed to shoulder by themselves. So, it was as they dealt with that they would also have to confront their imminent run-in with bankruptcy. You see, despite having raised funds from across the globe, no amount of money was even close to the amount of credit they'd generated. There just wasn't enough time to create that much capital. New would then come in with her report on Gettan, and soon after, Beta would too with her newly decrypted message, both of which would serve as the key to make everything make sense again, and all of which was identical to the novels. Sid was made out to seem like a mastermind again, and the way things conveniently worked out was probably the most blatant instance of dumb luck yet. It was yet another one of Sid's certified Eins moments, that over-the-top parody of things falling into place that just makes this series so entertaining. A funny part they had left out after this was the small mental breakdown Sid had when he noticed the gold was gone. In what was probably less than a minute, Sid had gone through pretty much every stage of the grieving process. He was first in shock, then disbelief, then before he knew it, he couldn't even support himself. His legs had given out and his hands were trembling. A cold sweat had started to break out across his forehead, then all he could do to calm himself was deny that any of it was happening. He repeatedly told himself that everything was going to be fine, but the more he stared at the empty vault in front of him, the more he knew that it wasn't. It had made him realize that what he needed now was action. So, after wrapping things up with a nervous giggle, Sid would be confronted by Natsu and Kana, then the rest was pretty much like how we saw in the anime. Since not much else needs to be added, we can now skip ahead to Gettan's confrontation with Yukime, a scene that should have shown us Yukime's awakened golden spirit fox form. If you were wondering what these glowing lights were in the anime, it wasn't just the attack that Yukime had used to defeat Gettan, but it was also the true form of those blessed with power like how she is. We did get to see the dense nature of its magical energy, but what we didn't see was the way her body transformed because of it. You see, as the final form of the nine-tailed spirit fox, not only did her tails grow larger and longer, but her eyes also changed from watery blue to bloody red. It had made for this ferocious yet elegant look that, when compared with Gettan, really made their disparity in power that much more apparent. Yukime would then press her fan right to his throat, but could do no more than that out of respect for the man that Gettan used to be. The precious memories of the times they shared together, combined with the fact that he saved her all those years ago, were the only things preventing her from truly getting revenge here. This may have been her giving mercy or some sort of kindness, but to someone who was as proud as Gettan, all this was nothing more than pity. To him, this was her looking down on him, an act that only went to make him even more angry. Gettan would then pop the pill just like how we saw in the anime, and it's from this point on that the whole fight would start to become vastly different. In fact, out of all the minor changes the anime has made so far, this was probably the biggest by a landslide. So, rather than a simple slash cutting Yukime on her back, she was instead straight up impaled without so much as a chance to even react to it. Her consciousness would slowly start to fade, and it was right as everything was about to turn to black that a familiar silhouette could be seen approaching from the shadows. The figure approached with no more than a subtle walk, but the way the snow danced around him as his wires sliced through the air clearly showed that this person was here on business. Business he would waste no time getting into, as the first statement he would make would declare his intent immediately. Sid would then reveal himself with the same constant stride as before, and it was after that him and his target would face off with a little bit of back and forth banter. He didn't just engage immediately like how we saw in the anime, but instead built on the tense atmosphere with several demands and insults. It was this long drawn out standoff in which both parties would stare intensely with the utmost hatred for each other. It was when all that talking and glaring was done that's when the two would finally engage in the most anime way possible, shouting each other's names like how they did back in the old school Naruto days. Gettan would of course be the first to strike, but right before his blade could reach Sid's neck, it would be stopped mid-air by some mysterious force not yet perceived by him. It didn't take long for Gettan to figure out what it was though, because the instant he felt his blade come to a halt, he had unleashed a wave of magic to sense all the space around him. It was this kind of sixth sense that would reveal the numerous wires that John had set up. It turns out that when Gettan had lost his ability to see, what he gained in return was some magic-like sonar that revealed everything around him. So it didn't matter how small and thin John Smith's wires were, because each and every one were clear as day when sensed by his magic. That being the case, the subsequent action was a series of attacks and dodges that made the whole thing seem like a stalemate. Gettan was able to navigate the wires and bring himself closer, but every time he did, Sid would just dodge and counter with a barrage of wires. That counter would never land though, as Gettan would always see them coming before they could even reach him. It was this constant back and forth in which neither seemed to be winning. All the while, Yukime would be watching in tears as the person she'd always seen so composed was now fighting on her behalf more enraged than ever. To her, he wasn't the type to bleed out emotion, yet here he was in a fight for something precious, clearly giving his all while absolutely furious. If not for the context we knew beforehand, you wouldn't be at fault for thinking John was fighting for her. It really just goes to make the whole situation that much more funny, or sad depending on whose perspective you're watching from. Now, this entire time Sid was looking like he was getting pushed back, but to anyone who knows how it is he fights, it was glaringly obvious that everything was in his favor. Sure, Gettan was the one who was clearly on the offensive, but with 0 attacks having made contact so far, it didn't really matter whether he was attacking or not. For Sid, who was always dodging though, somehow he'd managed to get in numerous strikes on his end. You wouldn't have noticed due to how small they were, but after a little while, countless tiny cuts could be seen starting to stack up on Gettan. It's certainly true that he was evading the wires no problem, but I guess seeing all of them still wasn't enough to dodge them completely. In fact, if anything, the only thing it was doing was preventing him from falling into a trap. As it is with the way Sid likes to set up these wires, it's best to consider them like a spiderweb. The moment you step one foot into their net, escaping becomes impossible. Not many are able to perceive just how masterful such a trap is laid, but to Gettan, who could sense every inch of it, even he was forced to admire its perfection. The way it was set was perfectly designed to predict, trap, and capture. The numerous cuts on his body were a testament to that. It was every time he tried to get even somewhat close that the cuts he'd receive in exchange would serve as a reminder that any closer was death. So, with the only option left being to swing his sword to no avail, Gettan would become trapped just like all the other opponents to face John Smith. He didn't even realize how it had happened, but at some point wires had managed to cut off all his escape routes, bringing us now to the first phase of his interrogation. We're not quite at the part where Sid's punching his face in, so what he does instead is slice his body every time he doesn't answer. With each rejection to one of his questions, another wire would move and leave Gettan bloodied. So that's when he would go and pull out the rest of his pills, but rather than get laid out before he could even swallow them, he was actually able to ingest them and turn into something stronger, bringing us to that second phase of this boss fight that I talked about earlier. With Gettan now this contorted muscular werewolf thing, his strength and speed would be beyond anything we've ever seen before. In fact, unlike any opponent that John Smith has faced to date, this one was actually strong enough to slice through all his wires. It didn't matter the amount of magical energy that was infused into them, because Gettan's newly acquired strength meant they all might as well have been paper. He was cleaving through them like they weren't even there anymore. Now, I can't really say that Sid was entirely shocked by this, but he did say "oh" as if to show that he was at the very least intrigued by it. Eventually, Sid would be left with no wires at all, but this was merely a lead up to one of the coldest lines Sid has delivered so far. You see, rather than use his sword or switch to another weapon, Sid simply stated how the wires were nothing more than steel, then proceeded to deliver the ungodly hand-to-hand beatdown that we saw in the anime. What makes this so particularly savage is that the way Sid spoke was completely uninterested, and it was all while doing a step-back dodge into an elbow counter. Gettan had thought John Smith would be useless without his wires, but what he found instead was that he had simply made his opponent even more dangerous. He had unleashed the martial perfection that is shadows. Now, there was nothing special about his fists, elbows, or knees, but the way he used them made it seem like they were the most specialized weapons in the world. They had revealed a crucial truth that not many people seem to realize about combat. When all is said and done, a man's body is his final, most reliable weapon. It's the only thing anyone can count on 100% of the time. So, with John Smith exemplifying this ideal with the fury of attacks, there was nothing Gettan could do to escape from it. With every step he took backwards, Sid would be 3 steps ahead, keeping him trapped in this close-range beatdown. It was a one-sided slaughter that could only be described as dispassionate and mechanical. If not for Gettan's enhanced regeneration, then it was likely he would have been dead 10 times over by now. So, with each hit shattering a bone, bursting an organ, or cracking a fang, it honestly would have been better if he didn't regenerate at all. It's because he was, though, that this continuous onslaught was much more akin to a never-ending torture. It was a self-made hell in which he initially thought all he had to do was endure. All he had was the hope that John Smith would eventually get tired. It's when he saw that he wasn't going to stop, though, that's when he realized, well, he was screwed. Especially when Sid started hitting both harder and faster. He neither slowed nor got weaker, but instead became ever more relentless until regeneration wasn't even possible anymore. So, with his regeneration gone and strength fully sapped, the only thing Gettan could do now was lay still and receive all the punches we saw. He would then curse his weakness like how he did so many times before, and the rest is pretty much the same as how we saw it in the anime. Yukime would find closure in the fact that everything was over and the walls she'd once put up to protect herself were now crumbling down in the arms of her hero. She would then leave to let Shadow do one last job, but unlike how we know it was to dig up the money, she believed it was to bury Gettan. If there was anything that she picked up from her last encounter with him, it was perhaps that he was just looking for somewhere to die. There was this peaceful expression on his face that made it seem that way. Now, if you're wondering what was in Gettan's letter, the core parts were an apology and the usual complaints about his weaknesses, then the final part was a mention of how the cult was behind everything. This wasn't an organization that Yukime was familiar with, but when faced with an offer to work with those who were fighting against them, Yukime was happy to provide her services. But yeah, that's pretty much everything from the finale to this credit crisis arc. The next episode is filler, so until we get something a bit more canon, I'll actually be doing a solo leveling video and possibly a free-run one. If you want to see those or just some more cut content, then feel free to subscribe to get notified. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!